Andrew Likoudis, thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
I've been really excited about this. So you just edited and contributed to a pretty interesting volume for my lights. It's called Faith in Crisis. Do I have that right?
Yep.
Okay. And what I thought was really interesting about this, one, was you've got an incredible list of contributors. We were talking in the car ride over here. I'm still amazed that you got Cardinal Robert Sarah to contribute to it, as well as Swan Sauna. Not that they're on the same level, but Swan might watch this, so shout out to Swan. But no, so one, just congratulations on that. Two, I found the title really interesting, Faith in Crisis. I found that no matter who I speak to in the Catholic world, whether they're, on a really traditional side, on a more progressive side, maybe that's not even the right dichotomy, but it seems that everyone thinks something is wrong. They just don't agree what's wrong. I was thinking in my head, there's another book with a very similar title that has, I think I have it on my shelf, by Dr. Ralph Martin. Takes a very different sense of what the crisis is, right? And I'm not asking you to weigh in on that, but I'm just curious, the sense of crisis, why do you think that is, and what is the crisis?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you bring up Ralph Martin's book because my book was inspired by his title in sort of like a contrarian way. It's like, I don't think it's the church that's in crisis. I think it's the people's faith that's in crisis. And I say that kind of loosely. It's not faith in the divinity of Christ that people are missing. It's faith in the ecclesiological implications of what faith entails. So whether they trust that the Holy Spirit guides the church, or to what extent, whether they trust that the hierarchy can do things for their good, especially after the sex abuse crisis. That's a very sensitive topic. And so my intention with this book was to respond to some of those really subtle underlying questions, which cause people to think about their own treatment of the magisterium, the way that they relate to their faith, whether it's do they place so much emphasis on tradition, or maybe traditions is the better word, but these lowercase t traditions that it may be good, may be holy, but elevating them to an undue emphasis, which sort of creates an imbalance.
Yeah, it does seem that so much of the question right now is around tradition. And look, I say this as an outsider looking in, and so I get that I don't know the nuances of all the debates, but I have kind of thrown myself into the midst of them by what I do on YouTube. And it seems that there's this question of, I think everyone wants to say the tradition is good. You want to say the tradition is good, right? Okay, we've got that established, and other people want to say the tradition is good. I think there's this question about like the living nature of the tradition, maybe. Like, is tradition just like the Council of Trent? Is it the glory days of some time past? Or is tradition what's happening now?
Yeah.
Even if you maybe don't love the current Pope's style or previous, but like it seems to me one of the questions is like, what is tradition? Is it something just past, or is it something today?
That's a good question. And I think we were also talking about this on the way here, is Congar has a different notion of tradition. He was one of the council fathers of Vatican II. Ratzinger's another. And they have this, they kind of disagree, but both of them recognize that tradition is living and that it involves change as well as handing down of what is essential. So Benedict, in his 2005 address to the Curia, really lays this out. And maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but this idea of reform in the church doesn't negate the idea of tradition. So we can have reform, and popes can have their various styles, and we can engage in this process of dynamic living out of the faith. And what that is tradition. And that might involve doing something a different way than your ancestors did. So your grandmother might give you a recipe for pumpkin pie, and you might change it up slightly according to your tastes, or according to your kids' tastes even. And that might be like analogous to the way we present the faith to others, or the way that we have relationship with people outside of our communion. Um, that's the basic way I'd frame it. Tradition is it. So the deposit of faith is unchanging, I would say, but the way that is understood over time deepens. De Verbum 8 says this, and we have to sort of trust. I would say we have to trust the magisterium to interpret that faithfully over time, and that's where the Holy Spirit comes in to assist. And Christ said to Peter and the apostles, it's this assistance of the Holy Spirit. I will be with you until the end of time. That's an ecclesiological statement.
Yeah, and another thing, it's going to be variations on a theme. We had a nice car ride on the way here, and we kind of hashed some of these things out already, but there seems to be this question of discerning that tradition. Mm-hmm. So I think from what I gather, not only do Catholics believe tradition is good, but I think people might be uncomfortable with the word change, but that our knowledge deepens of it, tradition encounters, new cultures, all of these things. But there's this question of discerning the, true tradition from false tradition, and whether that is kind of your job as the laity to say, hey, no, this development that's happening now, that ain't it. Mm-hmm. Or is that on the magisterium to do? And maybe just, if we want to dive into the deep end of this, I think one of those questions right now is like the death penalty, right? Yeah. That I think some people have this sense of, I can judge what Pope Francis or Pope Leo is saying against the tradition, yeah, and say he's on the wrong side of it. Or I can say, wait, no, he's the interpreter of the tradition, so I'm going to be on his side. Not to throw you right into the controversy, but I suppose to do precisely that.
No, that's great.
Hey, we'll be right back to this special in-person interview, but first I wanted to say a big thank you to my patrons. It's only because of my patrons that I'm able to make this show in general, and especially do these more resource and time-intensive in-person interviews. In fact, because of them, I've been able to fly out guests in the past, and I would love to do that more so that you can have these wonderful in-person conversations that you all enjoy. But to do that, I need your support. So if you consider supporting the channel, you can go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity to see more conversations just like this. And when you do that, you'll get early ad-free access to all my videos, access to my Gospel Simplicity book club, and a whole lot more. So once again, that's patreon.com/gospelsimplicity.
So with the issue of the death penalty, I would say there's a misunderstanding of what the tradition contains on a historical level. There were popes as early as the 3rd century saying we shouldn't kill a man even if he's killed somebody else. St. Augustine said that. Pope Nicholas I said that. There were multiple church fathers that were against putting a man to death. Clerics weren't even allowed to attend executions because it was considered it would sort of sully them. So the tradition isn't monolithic in that sense. It's not just the church has always taught the legitimacy of the death penalty, and therefore if we see this narrowing of the allowance, then that must be a contradiction to what came before. The way I would put it is our awareness of human dignity grew over time, and the seeds of it were already there in the early church, and the prison systems have been reformed in such a way that, and they've developed in such a way that it's no longer necessary. And it really comes down to the magisterium as the interpreter and as the lawgiver. Nobody likes authority in certain countries, and especially here. But we have to recognize that authority is a gift from God to guide us. It's not just an imposition on our lives. It serves the faithful transmission of tradition. Yeah.
And within this question of authority, I think there's another question, to what is the Pope's authority? Because this is something I experience conflicting visions of, I think. Yeah. On the one hand, and maybe it's just the nature of, I do a lot of stuff in like apologetics and where people are disagreeing on kind of technical things. But there seems to be this like big movement of, wait, but that's not infallible, which seems to be shorthand for saying like, and therefore I can ignore it. But to the best of my understanding of Catholic teaching, it's not quite such a binary between infallible and I can brush this off as though I don't care. And so I guess there's this question of when the Pope is saying something, even if it's not infallible, because it seems like, maybe that's relatively rare. I don't know. But there's a sense in which something is owed to his authority. You say we don't like authority. So I wonder, am I picking up on something real there? And what do you think maybe are the different visions on offer of like, what does it mean to follow the Pope? I'll just give maybe one example to put some skin on this idea. Is I was joking today. I put out a video on the Pope Leo's first apostolic exhortation to Lexite.
Yeah.
And I said, it's really funny. There's two ways for me to make my Catholic audience mad. One is to disagree with Catholic doctrine. Fine. Mm-hmm. The second is to say something nice about Pope Francis. Mm-hmm. And I get a lot of these responses of, hey, this isn't infallible. I know. But then they're like, and this guy is out of his depth. I don't have to pay attention to this. Like, this isn't, who cares? He's just giving me his opinion.
Yeah.
That seems like a novel take to me, but I'd be curious what your opinion is.
Yeah. So it's completely novel. Vatican I was very clear in establishing the Pope's authority and his primacy. So infallibility and primacy were both defined at Vatican I. His primacy is to say that he is to be followed in his teaching over everything else. So primacy is, I think, the most misunderstood dogma of the faith. It entails submission of intellect and will, as Lumen Gentium says, to the Pope's authoritative teaching, whether infallible or not. So the Pope has an extraordinary magisterium that would be ex cathedra decrees. And then he has an ordinary and universal magisterium, which is him united with the bishops in an ecumenical council, or repeating something over the centuries in Catholic teaching at a merely authentic level, but repeated so much that it becomes sort of enshrined in our Constitution. And then there's merely authentic magisterium, which is like a homily sometimes, or maybe a bishop's homily, which they participate in the magisterium also. So there's various levels to the magisterium. A lot of traditionalists will take this approach to, for example, Vatican II a lot of the time, and they'll say it's merely a pastoral council. It didn't exercise any extraordinary magisterium, only ordinary. Therefore, I can ignore it, and that's completely wrong. If they feel like they can trust the preconciliar popes but not the postconciliar, they should go look at the syllabus of errors and say, and see there that it says that any teacher who said that only the extraordinary magisterium is to be followed, that's an anathematized position. Catholics are not free to disregard papal teaching, even at the ordinary level. The papacy is a gift from Jesus to help guide his church, and Christ said to the apostles, "He who hears you hears me," and that was another clear ecclesiological statement that we are meant to follow the Pope in his official acts, regardless of their weight. And the weights can differ, and they can help us understand where the teaching falls in a hierarchy, but none of it's free to disregard. That's completely novel.
That's helpful. And I think I get to an extent why this happens in the apologetics world, because one, you're like, they're talking to people like me who aren't Catholic, and so you can kind of set up a narrower defense of what you have to defend in a way. And whether you'd agree with that or not, I don't know. I might be interested to hear. But I guess in that, like, I could get it if you're telling me on a technical level, this isn't infallible and you want to talk about contradictions or something like that. Makes sense. But it seems like that type of rhetoric might be forming people to think, who do become Catholic, oh, well, it's infallible or completely up for grabs. I'd be curious, does that explanation of it make any sense to you, or what do you make of that?
Yeah. I'll say this, and a lot of people won't like it, but in America we have this sort of anti-authority complex, and it makes us feel like we have the license to just ignore something we don't like. But being Catholic, as Newman says, it's not just agreeing to a set of doctrines that we agree with. It's to say that I'm going to trust the church in whatever it decrees, either in the past or in the future. And it's not on us to decide on whether the Pope got it right.
There's a really interesting, like, accompanying Lewis quote to this. Lewis has this piece on, he didn't write often on these polemical things. He, in the introduction to Mere Christianity, he's like, as soon as I became Christian, I thought it would be best to just focus on the things we agree on. But there's this one piece that was published after his death on why he wasn't Catholic. And he says, essentially, not only would I have to agree with all the doctrines, but I'd have to agree that they won't ever get it wrong in the future. And for him, that was the problem. But it sounds like for you, that's a feature, not a bug.
Yes.
Yeah. And
which is it should be a comforting feature also.
Sure.
Because it can tell you that as long as you trust the church, like, that's your cheat code. You don't have to worry about going astray.
Yeah. I wonder too, I don't fully understand how this works. Sorry for the laughter, everyone. A bird just flew into a window. That's not a funny thing, but it was distracting. In any case, so there's, if I understand this correctly, within Catholicism, there is like a narrow space for like theologians to dissent on certain things, that there's some allowance for that. Maybe you can explain it more, but I just have this gut feeling, and it could be completely wrong, that there's like this narrow window in which that exists, and now everyone thinks they're a theologian and those things apply to them.
Yeah.
Am I onto something at all?
Yes. So yes and no.
Okay.
Donum Veritatis, which is it's my favorite church document. It's on the ecclesial vocation of the theologian, lays out the conditions for withholding assent. And it's not to say that people are justified in withholding assent, but it says, if you cannot come to assent to this doctrine, this is how you have to do that. And it's to, like, I don't know how to phrase it exactly, but if you can't assent in your conscience to something that you find is contradictory or what have you, the response is, first, present your concerns to the magisterium. It can possibly serve as a constructive way to prompt a further clarification. Secondly, don't go to the mass media. Like, that's off limits. You can possibly raise concerns in an article in the hopes that it is clarified by somebody else, or maybe the magisterium reads it in the off chance. But so mass media is not a place to air your grievances. And then also, if none of that works, then you're called to suffer in silence, in the confidence that the truth will prevail if it's truly at stake.
And I think that's something really interesting there too. It sounds to me like maybe I used the wrong word. I'm hearing a distinction between withholding assent and dissenting. Is that a real distinction?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, because I just had the opportunity to interview a wonderful medievalist, and we were talking about freedom of conscience, and there is a long tradition of respecting freedom of conscience, but that isn't the same as, I don't know, being like a rogue ideologue. I
Saying
suppose.
it's justified to follow a misinformed conscience. It's justified to. It's always justified to follow your conscience, but it's not to say that your conscience is necessarily well formed or correct.
Or to try to talk other people into following your conscience.
Yes.
On your interpretation
Mhm.
of it. Yeah, I. We're just gonna get into all the spicy topics today.
Let's do it.
There was a movement. I don't know how big it was. I just know it by its like slogan. I don't even know if this is an official thing, but I heard a lot of people talking during different times in Pope Francis' pontificate of recognize and resist.
Yeah.
That sounds different than this. What do you make of it?
So recognize and resist was it was initially associated with Archbishop Lefebvre and his movement, the SSPX. It's kind of come a long way since then and become more mainstream in traditionalist circles, unfortunately. It's to say that we recognize the Pope's authority, but we disagree with him or dissent or don't accept any practice or discipline that he's instituted. It's to say we recognize that he's the Pope, we honor him as the Pope, but we don't accept this decision of his because we think it's wrong. And they usually cite Bellarmine or maybe Aquinas, who says it's okay to resist something that's in error, even if the Pope teaches it, which is it's a misquote. And Bellarmine didn't even think that the magisterium could contain erroneous acts.
Right. I from what I understand, this was somewhat of a
At least not
question in his time, but he didn't think the Pope could be a heretic.
Right.
But that seems like,
at least not in his magisterium.
Yeah.
So maybe as a private person, he could be a heretic. He said that it's likely that he can't, even in his private person, but he recognizes that perhaps it's possible.
Sure.
But he says it's certainly not possible that he could be a heretic in his official teaching. So we can, and then it comes down to the issue of trust again.
Yeah, and I want to do my best to like steelman the other side, because I'll admit, from my perspective as a Protestant here, looking from the outside in, for me it's like, well, if I were to become Catholic, like you just accept the whole thing and you're like delighted you've got a Pope, you just go with it. But that's because you've made that decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of people out there who I don't think they like want to be radical. I think they're looking at the tradition. They're trying to use their mind well, and they're already within it. And then things come up, and to them, like, it just on the surface, like, seems to be in contradiction, and they don't know what to do with that. We talked about the death penalty. I think, at Vatican II, there are people who felt this way on religious liberty or different things. And maybe they were just wrong in their interpretation. Maybe the things went together. But even that question kind of aside, I think there's this, like, what do you say to that person who's like, I'm not trying to be a troublemaker here.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just trying to use my mind well. And, I want to love the tradition. That's why I'm Catholic.
Yeah.
And when I look at what was considered sacred in the past, and it feels like we're now teaching something different, like, I'm just trying to call a spade, you know? What do you say to those people?
A lot of the time it's, and that's a tough question because you want to have answers. I would say leave it up to the theologians for the most part, but, a couple things to realize. One is the church calls on you to trust it. Ultimately, it comes down to trust. You can have, you can not have all the answers, but still decide to have faith in something. And I think it's a quote from Aquinas. It's like, faith seeking understanding is what we're called to. So we should give assent first and then seek to understand the technical details. and I know faith is maybe a big word to use when it comes to magisterial teaching. It's not like necessarily a dogma, um, but assent at least, and then assent seeking understanding. And Pope Paul VI got into this with Archbishop Lefebvre back in the 80s, and he said it's okay that you think that there's a contradiction between this document from Vatican II and earlier church teaching. What's not justified is that you're leading others into error with your by teaching explicitly that this new teaching is contrary to the faith. And he said the magisterium has provided clarifications, and it's good if you take advantage of those clarifications, but it's not strictly necessary, and assent is called for whether or not you understand it completely or not, which is, it's not an easy thing to just take that and say, okay, like, fine, you want answers, and you're not sort of content to settle with less, but sometimes things are just outside of your pay grade, and you have to recognize that. The Pope has usually thought these things through together with the College of Cardinals. He has the promise of Christ and the assistance of the Holy Spirit, and I'm not sure, like, they can issue clarification after clarification, but ultimately you have to trust that what they're saying is informed, and that they've studied the question, and maybe you can assist them with further clarifications if you also study the question. But it's not subject to your own judgment to decide whether something which the magisterial authority has discerned is correct or not. So in the Catechism it says the Pope and the bishops in communion with him are the sole authentic interpreters of tradition. And key word is in bishops in communion with the Pope, because if a rogue bishop goes and starts attacking the magisterium over the death penalty, or over communion for the divorced and remarried, or some other issue, maybe religious liberty, that bishop is not the magisterium, or he's not acting in his magisterial capacity at that point. So yeah, I think that's the most basic answer, and it's not an easy answer by any means.
Yeah, and I think people will appreciate you recognizing that's not an easy answer. I mean, it doesn't seem easy to me, right? When it seems like the type of thing that when things are going well, it's great, but when they're not, it's hard. And,
Yeah.
I forget, it was one of the older apologists who I think he actually wrote a book on, like, being a Catholic, like, I forget what it was. It was like, when you're a John Paul II Catholic under Pope Francis. Does this ring a bell?
I've heard.
Okay, yeah. But I do sympathize with that a little bit, because I think some people, who converted back in the day, like John Paul II, Pope Saint John Paul II at this point, and Pope Benedict XVI, like, whether you like them or not, like, they were great intellects. I've got multiple books up on the shelf that are Protestants appreciating Benedict XVI. I wrote an academic review on one of them, and he's wonderful. Like, I love reading him, and so I think there's a vision that the Pope
Great
is always
communicators.
he's always going to be like an academic theologian par excellence, and I think that's probably a bit abnormal. Like, and I think where it maybe becomes more of a thing of submission, a difficult thing I would imagine, is when people, like, feel smarter, or they have more background on something than the Pope, which is like very possible.
Sure.
You can have, like, more credentials, let's say, than Pope Francis or Pope Leo. But what I hear you saying is there's an aspect that you don't have, which is the guidance of the Holy Spirit. You don't have the office.
Yeah.
And just as a clarifier, I'm familiar with people talking about the protection of the Holy Spirit when speaking infallibly, but it sounds like you're saying that the Pope, not that everything he says is infallible, but he has, by nature of his office, like a gift of the Spirit?
Yeah. The way I'd frame it is you might have a scholar who's better versed in a specific field, or maybe he has some incisive insight about this topic. What we have to remember is that the Pope's assistance is it covers the entire exercise of his authority. It's not just infallible teachings. John Paul II, in a 1983, if I remember correctly, audience said this assistance of the Holy Spirit covers the integral exercise of his mission, not just extraordinary acts. Donum Veritatis, the document I mentioned earlier, says the same thing. It's all acts of the magisterium derived from Christ. So that should be your first, the first thing you recognize. It's coming from Christ through the magisterium. Maybe not like in a divinely inspired way, but in the sense that the Holy Spirit has guided the magisterium this far to make this decision, in a sense. Now, how they lay that out is up to them, but Peter and the apostles have the keys to bind and loose. So we have to assent first of all to that, and then following that, it might be possible that a theologian has some greater insight than the Pope on a specific topic, but that would never contradict what the Pope has taught, because the assistance of the Holy Spirit ensures that there's no serious error within a magisterial act. So the theologian may be able to contribute an insight which helps develop it further. So a theologian might, for example, disagree with the Pope allowing slavery back in the day, and his conscience might tell him that no, this is not okay. Two things to remember there: the Pope's never taught that slavery is good in a positive sense. They merely permitted it, and the theologian may be correct in his intuition that this isn't all right, and so he can contribute, but he would never say, like, I'm going to dissent from your authority on this topic, but I think we can go further. So instead of merely allowing slavery for, I think it's like chattel slavery versus this other form of slavery that the Pope's allowed, he said we can make it even narrower. The allowance for slavery it should be even narrower than this, and he might assist the magisterium, because that's the role of a theologian, is to assist. So yeah, I think that answers it.
Yeah, that's helpful. I want to get into a thing that you told me you posted on X, which I think is going to really like get to maybe the heart of this in a way. Correct me for what it exactly was, but you said you posted something like, if the Pope taught tomorrow that Satan was his brother. What did you post?
Yeah, so I said, if the Pope teaches that, well, it was a hypothetical. Let me say that first of all. The hypothetical was, if the Pope, through his official magisterium, taught that there were 4 people in the Trinity, or Satan is Jesus' brother. I think Mormons have some sort of belief there. Not totally sure, but if the Pope taught that through his official acts, Catholics wouldn't have the authority or the ability to judge the Pope as being wrong or heretical. Catholics don't have that prerogative. So, but that's not to say that the Pope can ever teach that. The Pope is protected from teaching anything heretical. The magisterium is indefectible. The Church is indefectible. The Church is built on Peter, the rock. Therefore, the Church's indefectibility flows from the Pope's. So we can trust that he won't ever teach anything that grievous of an error. because that's pure heresy. We can trust that the magisterium can't do that, and that's why we can also say, but if he did, I would be obliged to assent to it, because all acts of the magisterium require assent. You get where I'm going?
No, I get where you're going. Yeah, I can. Well, I can already imagine part of this being clipped out. I won't be the one to clip it.
No, that's
But I I can imagine people responding and saying like, are Catholics meant to just like shut their brains off then? Like, because in it, I know it's a hypothetical,
Yeah.
right? But I think
it's
I
meant
don't-
to be extreme.
right. No,
Yeah.
it works for that reason. I think there's less extreme examples that Catholic theologians feel like is something like this. Like the Pope is wrong here, even if it's not infallibly. It's as an exercise of his maybe ordinary magisterium. He's wrong, and they feel like it's plain to them, and to say it's not, it forces them into knots. I mean, there's this word. I don't know. I imagine you've maybe had it levied at you. I don't know. This title like Pope-splaining.
Pope-splaining, yeah.
Because I can imagine like this is an extreme
hyper-fatalist
example.
or
Yeah, but with the that there's a fourth member of the Trinity and it's Satan. Like if that happened, it sounds like the thing for the theologian to do would be like to find this really nuanced way of saying like, actually, if we consider this correctly, there is a sense in which, we're all incorporated into Christ, right? And we're all persons. And so in that way, in our incorporation into Christ, we are like, in a certain qualified sense, a fourth person as a person in the Trinity, which has three persons in it.
Yeah.
And the devil, even he, is in some way wrapped up in the cosmic nature of Christ, who draws all things. Like it's beginning to sound a bit crazy, but it sounds like, is that what you'd be committed to doing? And again, I know this is a hypothetical, but I think people feel like, is this what I'm committed to? Like, do I have to tie myself in knots?
I think we have to have enough confidence in the magisterium that it's not going to teach anything heretical. Whatever it teaches must not be heretical. That's the logical conclusion. Sure. If it taught something that we think is heretical, like religious freedom, a lot of people thought that was heretical, they would see a contradiction and they'd say, this clearly contradicts what came before, therefore I have to reject this later definition. Now, what theologians did with religious liberty was to say, this kind of religious liberty that was approved at the council, it's not the same kind of religious liberty that was condemned before the council. There is a nuance there, and it's in like, it's not religious. It's not the freedom to be like a religious relativist and just choose whatever religion you want. It's the freedom to follow your conscience, and the state can't coerce your conscience. So there is that nuance. As for the other question, Catholics shouldn't shut their brain off, but they should recognize that nothing will ever flow through the official organs of the magisterium that are heretical. And so if something did happen like that, it would be easier to say the Catholic Church isn't the true church than it would be to say that I can dissent and judge the magisterium as being wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to an extent that's always a live option. Like, to an extent, it's always an option to say like, well, this whole thing is wrong. What I hear from you and from people who kind of take this line is more that like, not that you want anyone to leave the church. I don't get that impression, but I see some people saying like, what you're doing, this you hypothetical person who's dissenting from the tradition, is like effectively being Protestant. So it's like if you're going to do it,
there are specific Catholic claims about ecclesiology and about indefectibility that if you want to be Catholic, you have to accept. If you don't accept those claims, those are dogmatic claims about the church's indefectibility, about papal primacy, maybe about infallibility if it comes into play. If you don't want to accept what the church has taught about X issue, then you would say, I'm not Catholic. You wouldn't say the church has it wrong and I have it right, because that doesn't comport with what you're obliged to follow in terms of your dogmatic obligations.
Yeah, and this gets back to kind of two visions of what it means to be Catholic. And I think this hypothetical person would want to say, I'm Catholic. The Pope's not Catholic. Like, there's that famous joke,
Yeah,
like, what
more
people
Catholic
would,
than the Pope.
yeah, like, is the Pope Catholic or whatever? But I think today people are asking, is the Pope Catholic? And I think there's people in certain, whether we want to call it traditionalist, whatever we want to call it, circles that feel essentially they're more Catholic than the Pope. Like, because Catholicism is this static, identifiable thing that they can see in past documents, and they can judge the Pope against that. And what I'm hearing is it's like that's not an option. To be Catholic is to go with what the magisterium today is teaching. And if you're not going to go with what the magisterium today is teaching, then you're not being properly, I guess I'll say, Catholic.
Yeah, you could be a cafeteria Catholic, but you're not following the church, which is like an obligation on the part of Catholics. Like it's a very simple obligation. You've signed up for this when you became Catholic.
It's like being in the military.
But you don't have to be Catholic. I mean, you should be. If you want salvation, I think if you know or you believe that Catholicism is true, then you should be Catholic, of course. But nobody said like you have to be Catholic. That's a decision that you have to make for yourself, and this is what it entails.
Yeah, and so I mean, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that not only what you would say to the Protestant, but essentially what you're saying to people who are dissenting? Like, do you want to be Catholic?
Yeah,
yeah.
That's basically it. A lot of people love the Catholic traditions, and I think this is where we get into this issue of traditionalism, which is they hold to these traditions that they love, and they have faith in most of the dogmas, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to following the Pope, they sort of draw a line. And maybe it's not totally their fault, because there's a lot of confusion. The media doesn't make it easy for them, and there's a lot of dissenting theologians that teach error. But elevating traditions to sort of these idols that we're just going to stick with what we know over here, and the Pope can do his thing, and we hope we get a better Pope in the future. And in the meantime, we're just going to do what Catholics in the past did. That's kind of like role playing. That's not real Catholicism.
What do you make of? This might be like too in the weeds, so if you're not like super familiar with the story, we can go to something else. But one of the people that I really enjoy is Saint Catherine of Siena, and I feel like she's someone who a traditionalist might hold up and say, like, I mean, she was very committed to the church. She also told the Pope, like, get back to Rome, my guy. Like, you're not meant to be out here in France. I don't care how good, like, the wine or the weather is. That's a little facetious, right?
Sure.
But, like, I could see someone holding that up as, like, an example of, well, this is what it is to be Catholic. You've got to tell the Pope what they've got to do. How do you interpret a story like that? Is it like, well, you're not Catherine of Siena? Is that the bottom line?
Well, I think Catherine of Siena was an advisor to the Pope already, so that's an important context detail. She had the Pope's ear, and the Pope was actively interested in listening to her. So she was welcome to offer that criticism or suggestion, whatever you want to call it. Catherine of Siena wasn't telling the Pope what to teach. She was saying, you belong here for a prudential reason. It had nothing to do with the magisterium or its teaching. She wasn't saying the Pope is deviating from orthodoxy by being in Avignon or wherever. She was saying, like, we need you in Rome. And that's completely licit. But she also did it respectfully, firmly, but she didn't insult the Pope, and call him names and harass him about it. Um, I mean, that's why we call her a saint today.
Yeah, and she had much stronger words for the anti-popes of her time and those who went with them.
Yeah.
Um, so I think this is really interesting. I wonder, one of the things within that story you mentioned is like she's already a pope, and like sorry, she was not a pope for the record. She was already an advisor to the pope,
Yeah.
and he cared to listen to her. Maybe we have a slightly inflated sense of self that like we think the pope should be listening to us.
Mm-hmm.
But you wrote a chapter in this volume on media,
Yeah.
and the role of that and all of this. What's fascinating to me is like some of the biggest voices in the English speaking Catholic world. I don't know that I'd call them dissenters, but I don't know too many who are like super jazzed about the most recent popes.
Yeah.
Um, what do you make of the role of media in all this?
Well, it can be a very useful tool, of course. I don't have a like dogmatic problem with people who criticize the Pope. I don't think that they're necessarily being dissenters when they do that, and when they express their disagreement or disdain or um, their grievances. But I do think it's unhelpful if we want to support the magisterium, which is there to help guide Catholics. If we want to be united as a church, it's unhelpful to write a tirade against Pope Francis or Pope Leo. So that's not a dogmatic issue so much as just like a practical one of like we should want to clarify things, not draw people away from the Pope's authority and undermine him. That's my basic answer.
What would it look like to criticize the Pope well?
Yeah. I would maybe offer suggestions, offer concerns, offer questions you may have. Probably not attack his person. That's first.
I think we call that an ad hominem.
Yeah,
I think that still applies. Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to criticize his acts, do so in a way that is respectful of his authority and with enough qualifiers that you're not going to undermine those reading, undermine his authority in the eyes of those reading your criticism. And typically you would want to address any criticism or suggestions through a channel that actually gets to him, not just something that other Catholics in your vicinity are going to read, because that's not the purpose.
Yeah, fair enough. One of the biggest, this isn't necessarily a criticism of any particular, well, it might be of like Paul VI maybe, but not of Francis or Leo, that I think a lot of traditionalists have is around the liturgy. And so I take it there's a range of positions from the Novus Ordo is amazing. Everyone should celebrate it every day. Only the Novus Ordo. To, you've got Novus Ordo is fine. I like Latin Mass, chocolate ice cream, vanilla ice cream, your thing, my thing, whatever. And then there's the Novus Ordo is bad.
Yeah.
Not just like I don't like it, but like it's bunk.
Yeah.
What part of your book is that the faith is in crisis because there's a crisis of trusting the church?
Yeah.
How does that fit within the ongoing liturgy wars?
Yeah. This is the most contentious topic, I think. And everything sort of hinges around the liturgy, unfortunately. So all the issues about ecumenism and religious liberty, and those are almost tangential when it comes to the liturgy. It's it's a tough area to address because I don't want to say that somebody is wrong for loving the traditional Latin Mass. Um, but I do think we have to take the words of the Pope and the Council and the Dicastery for Divine Worship, which is the curial arm of the Pope. We have to take those words seriously. The Council thought it was good to reform the liturgy. 2,000 plus bishops voted on it. It didn't pan out exactly how a lot of those bishops wanted necessarily, but that's because the Pope decided after the documents were issued that they were going to be applied in a way that maybe wasn't to the letter as much as they would have liked, which is his prerogative. That's part of what papal primacy entails. So documents are great for laying a foundation, but with the letter of any law, there has to be enough flexibility where it can be applied in a manner that's realistic and pastoral. So the Pope, Paul VI, he gave this, what's called the Concilium, the authority to interpret Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Council's document on the liturgy, interpret it, and then implement it. And so this Concilium, composed of various bishops, theologians, other scholars, like at the highest level, some of these were the best scholars in the world on the liturgy, and it's unfortunate to see them denigrated so much in the writings of traditionalists. This Concilium was given the mandate to implement the Constitution on the liturgy, and they did so. They created the revision of the Missal, produced the 1969 Missal of Paul VI, which is meant to replace the 1962 Missal. When they did that, there was a lot of confusion, naturally. The way that the Missal was received, especially in the United States, involved a lot of further experimentation that was outside the bounds of what the magisterium was allowing. You had people coming down the aisle on skateboards. You had people celebrating the Eucharist with Diet Pepsi instead of wine. A lot of just mayhem. People like to associate that with the council itself or with the concilium itself when they're completely different spheres. The concilium created the rubrics and created the general instruction for the Roman Missal to be followed. A lot of people didn't follow it. So you have what came after the council. You have a lot of people saying that the masses, they associated the mass with these abuses. That's wrong. The masses, not the abuses. How would I phrase this?
Well, can I'll ask a question here, because it seems like maybe there's three levels of things going on. So there's often this distinction between Vatican II, the documents, and then the spirit of Vatican II. But I feel like there might be actually three things. Maybe there's two categories within the spirit. So there's the documents, right? We can all agree on what they are.
Yeah.
Then I think what I might hear you say is that the spirit of the council is also like the authoritative interpretation of the council by the authoritative bodies to do that. And then there's the spirit gone wild of not authoritative. Like, this isn't the magisterium's interpretation of Vatican II and advice on how to implement it. This is, Joe Schmo in Kansas deciding skateboards are really the best way of getting down the aisle at Mass.
Yeah.
And
might be the quickest way. No.
It might. Well, it's quicker than walking most of the time.
Yeah, no, you touched on something really important. The spirit of the council has become this buzzword. And the way that it's used today, it's almost irredeemable, but I don't think it should be. with the letter of any law, there's always a genuine spirit along with it. What is called the spirit of the council is not actually the spirit of the council. It's this. It's a way for people to categorize or label what came later that doesn't accord with the documents. Now, some people get this wrong and they don't differentiate the documents from the concilium's interpretive frameworks. So the concilium issued 4 or 5 documents, if I remember correctly, and these documents were titled First Instruction on the Correct Implementation of Sacrosanctum Concilium, or Second Instruction on the Correct Implementation of Sacrosanctum Concilium, or something. Like, they were very clear that these are the interpretive documents. I lived in the Catholic world and debated about liturgy for years and years before I'd ever heard about these documents. So they're not well known. And then I looked at the documents, and it showed that a lot of the changes that happened, which don't necessarily line exactly up with the Constitution on the liturgy, it explained why those changes were made and why it doesn't line up exactly. But it's not exactly. It also doesn't justify the mayhem that occurred.
I'm not familiar with these, but one of the, I don't know, things that people talk about a lot with Vatican II and Sacrosanctum Concilium is, hey, like, wasn't Gregorian chant supposed to be given pride of place? Yeah. It doesn't say anything about, I don't think, ad orientem. Mm-hmm. What about Latin? You know, are those things addressed in those? Because I wonder, that seems to be a place where people say, like, spirit was all wrong, but maybe we can salvage the documents. Mm-hmm. Like, they seem decent, which this is half-baked idea. Almost like a type of like sola scriptura of Vatican II, like only the texts themselves, right, versus, right. It sounds like you're saying, I'm not familiar with these at all, but there's interpretive frameworks given by the church. Do those address any of those hot button issues?
They address all of them.
Oh,
I'm glad you brought those up. So Gregorian chant was a big one. They said it has to have pride of place. Still, so the Constitution says that, but the interpretive documents say it should have pride of place, but we delegate that authority to the national episcopal conferences to decide for their own territories. Because not everyone has a Gregorian chant choir. Like, if you go to the Amazon, you're probably not going to find that. Same thing happened with Latin. They said Latin should be used in the liturgy, but we're going to leave it up to the episcopal conferences to decide how much vernacular and how much Latin to use. As a prudential decision. Same thing with versus populum. Versus populum is interesting because the general instruction actually prefers ad orientem, even though Vatican II said nothing about it. And it says the altar should be built separate from the wall, and the priest should be able to say Mass facing the people, which is desirable wherever possible. So that wasn't in Vatican II, and people were very confused by that. There was a lot of construction of new churches, which seemed to make that the norm, but people weren't familiar with these documents, so they thought that was wrong. Let's see. Those are the main things, yeah. But yeah.
No, that's fascinating to me, and I think this comes back to, and maybe it's kind of a good theme and way to kind of tie a bow on this, is that there are different visions on hand. One is Catholicism is found in documents, only the infallible ones, preferably, and mainly the older ones. Mm-hmm. And one has more, which the latter of this is what I hear you putting forward, that it's not just something to be found in old documents. It's not just something to be found in old things, but it's the living interpretation of the church, mm-hmm. whether that be infallible or not. It's the type of thing that if you're going to be Catholic, you're signing on to.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah. And I think this issue of like what came later, there's a lot of questions about if something comes later, does it take precedence over something that came earlier, even if the weight of something that came earlier is higher. That's a tough issue. That's a tough issue to get into. Um, I think I think we have to recognize that church teaching develops only in one direction, and that's towards the fullness of truth over time, which will eventually be revealed in the eschaton. Um, but the church's understanding, so the church's understanding deepens, and the authority of the Pope is given to us in our time for today. That's another principle. So we have like various disciplines and practices which have changed over time. Um, the Pope is the one who discerns what universal decisions the church needs at this time in order to achieve the trajectory that he's discerned the church needs to be on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is helpful for me as an outsider looking in to get a sense of the debates that are ongoing and, what the broadest question of this is, what is Catholicism? I think that's, maybe been the theme of what we've talked about today.
Yeah.
Obviously, you cover a whole lot more in this volume, but I feel like we've gotten to hit a lot of the fun stuff. Was there anything you were hoping to cover today that we didn't?
I think we covered the main things. I think. Yeah, I would say in this, we talked about it earlier in the car, but this idea of thinking with the church, it kind of, the documents of Vatican II, we can get into like what the letter of the law says, but Vatican II was very much more so about the tonality of the documents, and they were exhortatory and poetic, and they were meant to inspire this grand vision of the church's role in the world. Pope Leo brought it up in the document yesterday. The church is meant to serve the poor, and it's meant to be sort of, it's not just getting souls to heaven, it's also liberating captives, feeding the hungry, doing these things which Jesus made very clear in the Beatitudes, but we tend to obscure it with these inter these debates, and we sort of spiritualize everything in a way that isn't right, because our faith is supposed to be incarnational, and our mission is here and now, and also for heaven.
That's a beautiful place to end. Andrew Likoudis, thank you so much for your time today. Your
Absolutely.
book, Faith in Crisis, will be linked down below. It was a pleasure having you.
Absolutely. Happy to be
right.
here.